Welcome to the Sustainable Dish Podcast. I'm Diana Rogers, a real food registered dietitian, author, and sustainability advocate. I co-host this podcast with James Connolly, who was a producer on my film, Sacred Cow. I also founded the Global Food Justice Alliance, an initiative advocating for the inclusion of animal-sourced foods like meat, dairy, and eggs for a more nutritious, sustainable, and equitable worldwide food system. You can check it out and join me at globalfoodjustice.org. Thanks again for listening, and now on to our show. Hey everyone, I'm really excited to let you know about the free Community Blood Sugar Challenge that I'm running for the month of February for my followers. You'll learn how to use a continuous glucose monitor, CGM, to find out how food impacts your individual body so that you can make the best choices when it comes to your diet. It was a complete game changer for me, and I recommend CGMs to all of my nutrition clients. I'm partnering with Levels to offer 2 free months when you sign up as a member to get the CGM without a prescription. Just need to visit sustainabledish.com/blood sugar, all one word, and enter your email to get the free ebook, access to the live Zoom calls, and the special offer from Levels. And if you're listening to this after our challenge has ended, you can still get access to my Blood Sugar Challenge ebook and the recorded Zoom calls, plus the special offer from Levels. Learning about how food impacts your blood sugar is valuable information that I think we all should know. Visit sustainabledish.com/blood sugar to sign up.
Hey guys, how's it going?
What's going on, James?
How are you? I actually really wanted to kind of think of this episode. And most of the people that I tend to interview are people that have recent books have just come out, or like a scientist who I think is adding, a lot of nuance to a lot of the arguments about meat or meat consumption or environmentalism or anything like that. One of the stranger parts about kind of interviewing people that I consider friends is sometimes it's more nerve-wracking for me to actually just try to have a conversation with you guys. And I've gotten to know you only through like an interview on your podcast and just back and forth that we've had over, I don't know, maybe the course of like a year at this point. Yeah. But I have been listening to your podcast a lot lately, just in preparation for this. And so I thought it'd be kind of fun to just sit down and like fireside chat, and kind of talk about the origin of where I found you guys. The interesting part about it was you kind of came out of nowhere. Everybody who's been in this fight has been in this fight for a very long time, or at least in our radar, because we were working on the film for a very long time. So a lot of the lightning that was coming out of a lot of scientists and activists and people and academics who were fighting for meat, we all kind of got to know each other very quickly. And then lo and behold, we get this like group of 2 dudes who kind of just show up out of nowhere, and they're like distilling all of these arguments down to some pretty like amazing content, and building this incredible platform to kind of talk about this stuff. And then from that, you, in essence, went from that space to then building a cooperative environment where you're actually like building networks within that environment of ranchers, of ideologues, of people who are like, good scientific thinkers, and activists. And building this whole sort of cooperative. And I'm like just sitting in awe from like the initial start from when I found you guys. So introductions, this is the Meat Mafia Podcast. This is Brett and Harrison. Why don't you do kind of, I want to kind of start out in a different way today. And so like having gotten to know some of the part of the origin story of who you guys are, the degree of knowledge that you've accumulated and the people that you've talked to, I almost like want to do kind of a thought experiment where like, all right, say you're on that South Carolina Amtrak train that's been stuck there for 37 hours. And lo and behold, you meet your 20-year-old self, or you're like your teenage self, and you have the time and the space to go and like break open their world and build something for them. Like, how do you start that conversation? Like, what do you bring into that? And like, who is that person that you're kind of talking to? You know?
It's a great combo. And honestly, this is the sort of stuff that gives me like chills, because I love thinking about these types of things and just like perspective that you can lend to, yourself 5 years ago. And like Brett and I were actually hanging out outside last night, and we were like, kind of feel like we like found our fit and like what we were supposed to be doing, which is a great feeling, having, just 12 months ago, not even started the podcast. So like, I mean, just like looking backwards through the lens of our podcast, like we've had so many amazing conversations over the past year with so many great people, like you were saying, across like a lot of different mediums. And I think it's taught us a lot about like where our passions really lie. And all of that was born out of like us just kind of acting and trying to like scratch the itch of like wanting to break away from these prior lives that we had, which was like, we both have corporate backgrounds, and found ourselves moving towards this more entrepreneurial path, but it like didn't happen overnight. And one of the things that like we've recently been talking about a lot is like, it feels like our perception of time and like the compounding effort that we've put in is now like shortened, where like every inch that we're putting in, we're getting more out of. So like, I think if I were stuck on that train with my younger self, I feel like things like really do just like push you in the direction that they're supposed to. Like, I don't think Brett or myself, I don't want to speak for you, buddy, but I feel like Brett or myself like wouldn't necessarily have had as much fuel or firepower to run at this as hard as we have if we hadn't have like gone through that period of like working something that we didn't love and like our heart wasn't invested in. I don't know if you've ever felt that, but it was like we kind of had to like go through that to like come to this realization of like, oh yeah, this is what we want to do. And I think we've realized that over the past year of recording like 136 episodes of the podcast in a short period of time, like having cool conversations. We're like, man, this is like what we want to do.
Yeah, I would say, James, this podcast is special for the both of us. And I was going to ask you, do you remember how you and I connected, how the three of us had connected originally? I'm curious if you remember, because it's how we kicked off the podcast when you came on.
Yeah, Kellogg, baby.
Yeah. So I wrote a thread on Twitter, and I think the header was Kellogg's wants you to stop having sex. Here's why. And it was an informational thread, classic header, some type of header that we would do. And I think you had commented on it and basically were like, this is a really good thread, but the history of John Harvey Kellogg is so much more than you even understand. There's so much more sickness that had gone on behind the scenes. And so I clicked on your profile and I was like, holy shit, it's James Connolly, produced Sacred Cow, which is a massive influence on both of us. So number one, that was really cool. And then you and I jumped on a call shortly after that. I was living in San Diego. I was still working a corporate job. And Harry and I had just started writing on Twitter. We had literally recorded 2 episodes of the podcast when you and I had connected, James, and we had no idea what this whole thing was going to turn into, but we just knew that it felt right. It felt really good. And people were starting to resonate with the message. You were one of the first guests that we'd had on. So now to kind of like turn the tables and be on your show when you're someone that's had a massive influence on us and the work that Diana has done, it's pretty cool and it's pretty special to be honest with you, but it's cool to start off with that.
Yeah, it's like this unspoken feedback too, because I feel like having you on our show early on like gave us this confidence, like, oh wow, we just had the producer of Sacred Cow on our show, like let's keep going, like who knows where this could go. So it's like, it's really cool, just like, I mean, we really appreciate like even just that, like you coming on our show, and then like the effect of that just building over time, like building confidence in yourself over time. Like, yeah, like there's a lot of traction here. We can keep going with this.
Right.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'll watch you guys come from afar sometimes, and you're like, you'll reach out to your Twitter community, and you're like, does anybody know Michael Chandler? And I'm like, What? And then, a week later, you're sitting down and having a conversation with him. And for people who don't know, Michael Chandler is a total UFC badass, like absolutely stunning fighter. Just one of the most dynamic, amazing guys. And every time he walks into the cage, that he's giving 100%. And he's just built this like whole family and lifestyle and mindset and all of that stuff, and you guys are just sitting across from him like, how you guys fucking do that?
Well, to your point, James, it's like that's the really cool thing about the internet, is how it's the ultimate double-edged sword, where it can be this like massive consumption model, but also it can connect you with some of the most amazing people. Like I would say, not over 90% of our guests have just come from organic relationships and connections that have been formed on Twitter. And we really do live in this generation where you have a device that can allow you to connect with anyone, anytime, anywhere. And for us, I think we've always just believed that, we can do the things that we set our mind to. And the reason why I'm saying that is we went on a road trip back for Christmas. So I'm from New Jersey, Harry's from DC. We're living in Austin right now. So we were like, okay, well, we're gonna road trip back home. Let's do a podcasting road show so we can hit a bunch of really cool guests, people that we look up to. So we saw Will Harris at White Oak Pastures. We saw Joel Salatin at Polyface Farms. We hit up a regenerative farm, Counterculture Farms in the Dallas area. We just kind of made our way up, and we knew that we were going to be passing through Nashville. And we had seen that Chandler had been posting some things about the carnivore diet and more things about nutrition and the food pyramid. And we said, well, why don't we just try and reach out to him for the hell of it and see what happens? So we messaged him on Twitter, and then we shot him a DM on Instagram, and he responded. And up till like the day before we recorded with him, we didn't actually know if he was going to come on, because he's got 1.5 million followers and obviously isn't really monitoring his DMs. And then last minute, he was like, let's book it. I'm in. I'll come on 10 a.m. And we're like, holy shit. We just looked at each other. We're like, holy shit, we have Chandler coming on the podcast. And it's just, you just don't know what can happen. Special. What are you going to say?
I was just going to say too, like, I'm one of these people who like looks back and like feels like there's like it's just so many weird coincidences, right? Like, so we had a speaking event in September where we didn't get to record with Will Harris, which we were like, oh, this is such a loss. Like, we just missed out on recording with Will Harris live. And then we were like, let's create our own destiny here and see if we can come back to White Oak Pastures sometime in December when we're going home for Christmas. And then like that whole trip was, based around Will Harris, but then we were like, where else can we stop along the way? So it's kind of like, just turning that moment of like, man, we really just missed out on an opportunity that was really, really perform on our part. And then just seeing how it unfolded into an opportunity to speak with one of our idols, Michael Chandler. It's like, it was just really cool.
Yeah, my team for Death in the Garden, our next film, ended up. I could not get there. I could not get to Belgium because me and my family were in Iceland for a holiday, and it would have taken like 24 hours of travel just to try to go through all the processes of getting there. But they sat down and interviewed Frederick Leroy for, I don't know, like 3 hours, 3.5 hours, just like tried to pull as much content out of that as possible. And then they went out to dinner with him afterwards. And that was like another 4 hours of like, Frederick over wine. And they were like, my God, if we had just recorded, like if we just kept this rolling, like we could have just solved the whole like problem, the whole global like war on meat all together. Yeah. But that's a lot of the conversations. Yeah, that's a lot of the conversations we've had is like, over wine or over meals, like being able to sit down and really sort of break apart people's narratives. Because like talking to your 20-year-old self, you'd be like, all right, well, I'm going to sit down with this UFC fighter who's at the top of his game, who, his cardio, like, off the charts. But then I want to sit down and talk about soil science for 4.5 hours. Like, how do you explain that to your 20-year-old self?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because when I was 20 years old, I was definitely consuming a lot of podcasts, but I was definitely in that typical college mindset of like, I wasn't being mindful of the food I was putting in my body. I was drinking all the time. I was just starting to get sick with ulcerative colitis, which is kind of how part of the genesis story of how this whole thing got started. But I don't think I had confidence in myself as a creator. I was just thinking to myself, oh, I love consuming these shows and I'm learning a lot about it, but I don't know what would I even specialize in? What do I really know? And I think that's something Harry and I went through when we first started the Meat Mafia earlier this year, was like, okay, like, are we really qualified to be speaking about this stuff? And it's, of course you are. It's like, you've had your own anecdotal experiences. You've done the 10,000 hours of research for yourselves. You've tried carnivore. You've tried these different things with red meat. You have a simplified approach to nutrition that works. And if it works for you, why not at least share it with the world in your way and just see if it resonates with someone? So the whole point of me saying that is, like, to your point, James, like, I wish younger people or the 20-year-old version of yourself understood that just because you're not an expert at something, that's okay. You can be an enthusiast, and so much good could come from you just trying to share those gifts, or, create a piece of content. Like, I imagine if we had started 8 years ago, where we would be now, it would probably be unfathomable. And not that I would do anything different. The exact path happened the way that it was supposed to, but I hope that younger people understand that message. And I hope that people lean into podcasting and creating online, and, it can be such an amazing thing.
Yeah, I remember reading a book like years and years ago. It was John Rady. I think it was John Rady. It's a book called Go Wild, and he had created this program called Spark that had what it tried to do was incorporate physical fitness into educational curricula. And so, if you had somebody who was not doing well at math, you would have gym before the math test. And so they functionally, like, put physical fitness as an addendum to the educational experience, because they knew that the school would do better. And the schools that he actually worked with, the pilot studies for it, were performing, as some of the top schools in the world in terms of academic testing, by just changing this one thing. But he wrote this book called Go Wild. He tells this one story about this girl who had undiagnosed celiac disease for years. And I still remember this story where she, like, woke up, she had a 2-year-old child, and she couldn't even she knew she had to eat something because she was so calorically deprived because of celiac. But she crawled to her refrigerator, opened up her refrigerator, and tried to get something in her mouth. And every single time she went to the doctor was like, well, what can you digest? And it was like slim fast shakes and mashed potatoes. And he was like, well, that's what you eat for the rest of your life. And so, like, you look at the the medical experiences of a lot of people who have been dealing with chronic illness for a very long time. They almost have to be their own advocates. They have to be their own enthusiasts for their own health journey. And it's so difficult for people because we grow up within this realm that always looks to authority, and authority is supposed to know better. But your personal journey, like through ulcerative colitis or, all of that stuff, like, that is, man, that's like a PhD, just trying to sort of figure out, like, how you're going to live the rest of your life.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Harry and I were talking about this yesterday, because I think I was mentioning to you, we went back home for the holidays. We both visited our parents. Then we came back out to the ranch in Bastrop, which is a town right outside of Austin. It's where we've been living. And we've just kind of, we were recapping everything that happened in 2022. We were talking about 2023 goals. And even just with, like, the origin of the show kind of stemmed from these events that you would consider to be like a red light that actually turned out to be a green light. So, when I was 21 and I got diagnosed with colitis and I'm shitting blood 20 times a day, and you're getting on medication, you think of that as a red light. But through that process, it actually taught me that the body is capable of healing if I nourish it with the right foods, if I take care of myself, if I meditate and practice mindfulness to mitigate stress. And it's ultimately proved that the body is this incredible healing machine. And unfortunately, a lot of the modern diseases that we're suffering from as a society, it's because we're not fueling ourselves with the right food. So a lot of our mission is, like, how do we teach people what those foods are and correct the narrative on what the right foods are that we're supposed to be eating? but a lot of that stemmed from these red light events, like even Harry, and I'll let you tell it, like, you know, kind of gaining weight during COVID, but then that forces you to take inventory of the food that you're putting into your system, like a couple red light events that turn out to be green lights down the road.
Yeah, I feel like adding to that too, like James, you talked about like always looking to authority for like some sort of direction. And I think one thing that we try to preach on the show is like, we don't want to like replace just another authority. We want to like make people feel comfortable thinking for themselves and building out their own intuition. So like one of the things we talk about all the time, it's like experiment. Like we've lost this idea of like like I'm speaking in generalizations, but like for a lot of people, I feel like self-experimentation just gives you the feedback you need to either continue the course or go a different direction. And like, if you don't develop that strength of like being able to acquire the knowledge you need to make decisions or to change direction, like you really just become very susceptible to just like kind of following the path. And you know, it's not always a healthy path given like where we are kind of as like a race or a species in terms of health.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking about that a lot when I was listening to a conversation, Harry, that you were having. But one of the books that I was reading recently was talking. He said the definition of health used to be the absence of disease, and that's such a like poor definition, right? So like by every metric and standard, Harry, you were probably like fitter than, you know, had every single advantage going for you because you know, like you're working in finance, you obviously have the money to spend on food. You know, you're part of physical culture, you played baseball, you had all of that stuff, but you recognize, because you were actually in tune with your own body, that when it started to fail, that there was a like a cutting off point where you're like, no, I need to sort of figure this out and change. You know?
Yeah. And I feel like that like this kind of speaks on like a theme that might be like a quiet theme of our show. It's like, it's all connected, where like, you know, I did have all the resources to be really healthy. And by all accounts, I was still a healthy person, but like
Right.
working a job that like wasn't like, yo, your heart's totally in this, like this is your life's mission, like, and you're sitting in an environment that isn't perfect, like it makes you start to act kind of like out of like I was acting out of like a almost like a different innate like character, like you know, sitting in a desk, like eating Doritos, eating Oreos, like that was like so like it contrasted a lot with like who I was in college, which was like willing to experiment with paleo, eating healthy, but then you just start like slowly going down a different path. And sometimes it's easy to just to like go down that path and not even realize it. And so I think like COVID kind of like snapped me out of it. It just gave me like a moment in time where I had like hours back in my day to be like, okay, not commuting anymore, not going to the same environment in the cubicle. Now I have more time to cook, maybe get a little more sleep, make my like exercises very consistent. And like within a few weeks, I built the momentum to be like, okay, like I was literally just like going down a bad feedback loop of like habits and patterns that like probably wouldn't have corrected itself as quickly as it did if like COVID didn't happen. But I think like that wake up moment happened and I was like, okay, like I'm back. Like, like I feel good again. I feel like an athlete again. And like, that was like one of those moments in life where it's like, I'll never let that feeling go. Like I need to always remember this moment because like, I want to be a healthy person and just like continue to have those habits. So yeah, I think turning your health around is like, it's hard, but it's just such a positive event that like seeps into everything else in life. Like we wouldn't be doing the show if both of us didn't like find ways to get healthier on our own and like start to like build that foundation.
Yeah, and you know, I think one of the things about being in New York or being into, you know, if you guys were in major urban cities, especially when you're working in jobs that say you have a law degree and everybody else is working 70 hours a week, so you're trying to work 72. You know, like every single aspect of that, without a COVID break, you probably would have just continued doing what we as social animals would do, and just keep on doing this thing that you're doing, and just think, and that becomes your kind of cultural norm. And then next thing you know, it's like a decade has gone by and you're like, holy shit. You know. Right.
Well, and I feel like a lot of my decisions, like after I kind of had that light bulb moment, were a lot of like hard breaks, like hard splits, like quitting a job. Like if I hadn't have had, if I had been continuing to go into the office, I definitely would have just found another like job in finance and real estate, and just, you know, seen if that was like better. And like, I think I was just willing at that point to like make a hard break and be like, look, like you can always come back to this if you really want to, but like go see if there's something else out there for you. And I think a lot of that confidence and like ability to make that decision was built in that time period of like getting healthier.
Yeah. And so where are you guys now? Because it seems like you're in this constant state of awe. Like you're doing field harvests, like you're breaking down animals, you're going to places where like you're doing workshops on, you know, have you started getting into hunting yet? Like where are you going? Like what's the awe experience that you're doing now?
I think it's just, everything has just been a really natural evolution. Like we started off small, just writing on Twitter, just to see, you know, how do people resonate with some of the stuff that we're putting out there, and people resonated really nicely with it, and people want to come to awake to the food that we're putting into our system, which was really encouraging. So then we said, okay, well, I think the next medium that makes sense is let's start a podcast, because we're not experts, we're enthusiasts, but there are so many awesome experts that we've come across that have taught us. Let's go ask them the conversations that we want to have. So we've gone down the podcasting rabbit hole. And like Harry had mentioned, you know, it's been 135 episodes since March 1st. That was when we had launched the show. And I think since then, it's been trying to lean in on these interesting experiences that can teach us as much as possible. So like going to a few bison harvests out at Rome Ranch in Fredericksburg, like, you know, we're both guys that want to hunt. We've never hunted before. Like you had mentioned, James, I was living in New York. Harry was living in Boston, huge urban cities. I didn't grow up hunting. I didn't have that appreciation for death or really where my food came from. Even when I went carnivore in 2019, I really just started buying steak and beef from the local grocery store. So you pick it up in a package, but you don't really think about where that animal comes from, or you kind of want to just block it out of your mind. The team at Rome Ranch in Fredericksburg, they do such a good job of curating these experiences where you're paying to go to the event and you're actually watching the bison die and be harvested. So you watch it get shot, you watch it get butchered, you know, they put you in a circle and pass the bullet around, and you literally say a prayer over the bullet and inject some energy into it. And it's just a completely different experience. Like I remember Harry had gone to the first bison harvest and they sent him back with a bunch of the liver and the heart from the animal that had been put down. And we just looked at each other and we're like, I can't believe that the organs of this animal are from an animal that was alive like less than 24 hours ago. Like it was just a different mindset that I had ever had about food before. But I think for both of us, it's, you know, if we're going to push, you know, carnivore, animal-based diets, like how do we get closer to the rancher or closer to the hunt? Just get closer to that overall food process and really where it comes from.
Yeah, and I think that in that way is the gateway to like a greater understanding of, you know, what Marin and Diana and I talk about a lot is civilization, like what it is, and you know where it came from, and how it's built around all of these different edifices that I don't necessarily want to belong to, right? So when you talk about a lot of, you know, in some ways, the way that modern medicine will treat the symptoms instead of the illness, psychology will treat the symptoms instead of the illness. You know, it sort of build this relationship with the world where you're not constantly trying to like remove yourself from the idea that something dies for you to eat. It's almost kind of a weird spiritual journey that like kind of start, like you end up kind of going on, and then you want to study more about like all the aspects of that, you know?
Yeah. I think it's like this idea of like thinking about things from first principles and like trying to figure out the why behind everything. Like even, and I think like food has kind of been our lens to figuring that way of thinking out, but it's like so applicable across like all different things, like relationships, like building a business. Like, why are things working the way they're working? And like it really does kind of like enforce that first principles thinking, and like, I don't know, like, yeah, why society functions the way it does. It's like, I mean, that's an endless like conversation.
Oh, totally.
and like trying to figure out the understanding of that. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you almost have to be an anthropologist kind of studying the human species at this point, right? Because you're
Totally.
like, the World Health Organization will tell you that sunlight is a carcinogen. That you that dirt, like there, you'll see multiple reports on dirt and how it's equally good for you and also bad for you as well. That spending time out in nature can be equally good for you and also dangerous. And you get all of these different sort of aspects and perspectives on the world, and so much of it really has to do with a denial of death, right, in so many different ways. So when you're holding that heart in your hands, you can't ignore that anymore, right? You go into a supermarket, you see packaged foodstuffs that look like, it'll never look like a chicken. It doesn't have the feet on it anymore. The head is gone, the feathers and all of that stuff. And you're like, the supermarkets are like the church of denial of death in so many different ways.
100%. And that's what you guys did such a nice job of on Sacred Cow, is addressing this concept of death and taking the morality out of it, and actually interviewing farmers and ranchers that are the most closely associated with death out of anyone, and just giving it that unbiased perspective and letting them speak to it. I think, unfortunately, what we're finding is, on the side of veganism, there's just this denial that death exists, and like there's this ability to escape death, which we just fundamentally don't believe to be true.
It's like one of the few objective truths out there, right? Like,
yeah, totally. I'll tell you, the first time I met Diana, it was at Paleo FX. And she had a few placards up. I think she was speaking there, but she had a few placards up. She was just standing there. She was working on a documentary film. Originally, it was called Kale versus Cow. And so we ended up kind of changing it. But one of the things that I remember the most about that conversation was that she said that so many ranchers that she talks to won't eat the meat that they grow and raise because they're so afraid of cardiovascular disease, and they're so afraid of the health implications because they've absorbed it from the environment for a very long time. So they were growing food that they didn't think that they had the right to eat anymore. And that really stuck with me. I mean, it's like a 6-year-old story, but it was like, we were like, we have to do something about that,
Yes. Yeah. My version of that story, James, is when I first went carnivore in 2019, I was working a tech sales job in New York City. And so like, being in tech, surrounded by a lot of engineers, and we had a shared kitchen space. And so I had first gone carnivore, and I was making very basic dishes and bringing them into the office. So, cooking up ground beef or cooking up chicken thighs, chopping up steak, things like that. And by going carnivore, I'm effectively like reversing all the symptoms with my stomach. My bleeding is going away. My stomach feels better. My anxiety is going away. My skin is getting better. I'm seeing all these incredible benefits, and I'm doing, marathons and triathlons, and I'm probably the healthiest person in the office objectively. And I was having these engineers that are like, a lot of them being like 30, 40 pounds overweight, that are eating pizza for lunch and drinking Soylent, and they're looking at me and asking questions like, dude, you're going to like die of a heart attack. Like, what do you mean you're just eating steak? And I'm just thinking about I'm like, these are some of the smartest people I've ever met. They have PhDs from MIT. They've gone to Harvard. They're engineers, yet they have no idea about what to eat. They just have zero clue about nutrition. And we've just kind of like normalized these things that shouldn't be normalized. And unfortunately, like red meat has just become an unfortunate scapegoat in the whole process.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the people who push back on the narrative on red meat specifically were engineers as well. All right, so they looked at it in the mechanistics of it and said, wait a second, something's not adding up here. It was a Dave Feldman who started experimenting on himself, because he was like, well, we measure cholesterol one day a year at an annual physical. this is probably a variable measure that has any number of different properties that are happening, whether it's poor sleep or poor nutrition or too much of this or too much sugar. He said, well, why don't I just measure my cholesterol over a long period of time and just pay for that? Just get it every couple of weeks and see what that looks like. And you just find the variability for this thing that is supposed to be a measure of how you are, like the prevalence of chances of getting like cardiac disease. He's like, this is all over the charts, so a lot of the engineers are the ones who kind of like mechanistically tried to sort of break it down and say, wait a second, maybe some of this doesn't necessarily make sense.
Yeah, it's almost like the perfect person, like an outsider from the medical community, but still has that like very process oriented brain where
right,
logically jump through every hurdle to be like, wait, like this isn't adding up. This system doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And, I think in some ways the medical community, like, I don't know if you ever looked at those like old experiments where they would, who is it? Ansel Keys did one of the original starvation experiments.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So he took a number of conscientious objectors during World War II, and he said, well, listen, you're not willing to, you have an ideological reaction to fighting, but would you do something that would actually help with the cause? And he took a number of these young men and in essence kind of starved them over a long, I don't remember how long the period was, but enough to the point where they were like, the huge psychological reactions. They used to look at like recipe catalogs and like, that was their porn. It's like just looking at pictures of food. But the medical community would never pass or allow that to happen nowadays. And so what we see now are like these weird sort of mechanistic experiments done with people where they talk about the effect of, say, soybean oil on a 3-week experiment on college students, or avocados on, physical performance. And you're like, why do we keep on doing this? Like, it's these ridiculous arguments that you're constantly seeing all the time. Like, you'll see on NBC News, chocolate is associated with this or, associated with that. And you look in, you dive into those experiments and you're like, well, this was done over a period of like 2 weeks with normally healthy people. And then you took one measurement and made, extrapolated enormous amounts of like data from that and, expectations from that.
Yeah. It's almost like that's a really important point. You hope that you could teach society to like look at these sound bites or these percentages or these studies, like, just don't take them at face value and be willing to go a little bit deeper, whether it's like pro red meat or anti red meat, and really understand, who is conducting the study, who is funding the study, is it an observational study, how, understanding the data, like all these different factors that really play into it. I think that that's something that I've definitely learned since I've gone on my own nutritional journey, because, I remember going before I went carnivore for the first time, I had all the old misconceptions that anyone else has had, that it's going to, increase my LDL cholesterol. It's terrible for you. It's inflammatory, when in fact, running towards those animal products was the best thing that I had ever done for my health. And we're, every single day we get DMs from people and connect with people that have had, very similar experiences by returning to those foods.
So was the Joe Rogan interview the Sean Baker one, the one that kind of, because like that was, when did you find that?
It was 2 parts. So I was a huge fan of the documentary Bigger, Stronger, Faster when I was younger by Chris Bell. And so I followed Chris on Instagram for a long time and knew that he had always struggled with his weight. He was a shorter guy, but he was, always decently overweight. And then I had seen a picture of him, I think sometime in like 2018 or 2019, and he had looked completely different. Like he looked like he had lost 50 pounds. And he started posting about this carnivore diet that he was following, eating all red meat, eating all animal products. And I was like, this is the craziest shit that I've ever heard. And he had posted about Dr. Baker. Right. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And, Dr. Baker, obviously he's an absolute moose. He's like 6'5", jacked, right. Emergency surgeon, was a veteran. And I was like, all right, he's been on Joe Rogan's podcast. Let me listen to his Joe Rogan podcast. And was just very surprised at how non-dogmatic and how simplified his approach to nutrition was, to the point where I think he said during the interview, he's like, look, eating all animal products for me works now. It might not work in the future, and I'm open to that. But, right now I feel better than I've ever felt my entire life. And that stuck with me. And then he had also started talking about how a lot of patients that had autoimmune diseases were having incredible benefits from switching to an all meat removal diet. And it specifically mentioned IBS, Crohn's, and colitis. So for me, I'm like, okay, I'm on a drug and medication that's costing $50,000 per infusion every 8 weeks that I'm dependent on. Why would I not try and experiment with the food that I'm putting in my system to see if I can maybe heal my body and have similar success? So it all kind of stemmed from me just leaning in and being able to connect with these amazing people on social media that proved to me that healing was possible. And that was all around 2019.
Yeah, that's pretty stunning. The story. I listened to you on Kate Kavanaugh's podcast, and just when you run the numbers on the medications and how long you're on it, you're like, my God, this is unbelievable.
100%. And
right?
yeah, and that's just for people with colitis and like these, people are. I was on a drug called Remicade, and Remicade is an immunosuppressant that treats a ton of other autoimmune diseases. So you think about the fact that there are 25 million people. God only knows how many different types of medications and immunosuppressants there are. That cost is freaking astronomical, let alone the cost of insulin and all these other medications for these modern diseases that we've effectively created. It's like, you just run the numbers and it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's interesting too. Like, I remember when Brett told me he got off medication, we were running in Boston, and like, I didn't even really realize that he was on medication or like really sick to begin with. So like, from an outsider's perspective, I've found it very interesting that, I mean, this type of like IBS, Crohn's, colitis, a lot of these chronic diseases are something that like people just like obviously don't want to talk about.
Yeah.
Like, they're embarrassed by it. And then like, as I've like gotten to hear Brett's story more, like putting myself in his shoes more and more, it's like, geez, can you imagine being like on a date and like having some like a flare up? Like, that's the most embarrassing situation you can like envision. So for me, it's like, how do we get people like talking about this comfortably and like understanding that like there are other ways out of this? And like, thankfully there's a world where like maybe there are alternatives to these expensive pharmaceutical drugs.
Yeah, guys don't talk about that stuff until it's over.
Yeah,
no, totally. It's like, I don't know. It's like you want to appear like you're masculine, but like I remember being 21 when I got sick, and I was going out on dates, and there were girls that thought that I had a Coke addiction because I'm going to the bathroom like 4 or 5 times.
Oh, Jesus!
Getting drinks, you know what I mean? But it's like it's a very interesting feeling to be like, I'm a grown man, and I feel like I'm capable, yet I can't even control the most basic human function of like going to the bathroom. It's a really strange thing. And it's unfortunate because part of the issue with things like IBS and Crohn's and colitis is we don't proactively talk about it. We just hold it in, we keep it in. And then by the time we actually go to the doctor or we get rushed to the hospital, it's already too late. We're in a full-blown flare up. And then you're on the hook of the medical system, or you need to be on some drug to stay in remission.
Yeah.
Ready to take your support for a nutritious, sustainable, and equitable food system to the next level? Join my Global Food Justice Alliance community on Patreon and have access to ad-free podcasts, exclusive videos, and a discussion community, plus so much more. Go to sustainabledish.com/join to support my work, and thank you.
Yeah, I was listening to a comedian last night, and he was talking about his father got COVID, ended up in the hospital, never told anybody. And so when he finally got out, he called up and he was like, "Hey, I got COVID. I was in the hospital." He was like, "What?" He didn't tell anybody.
Yeah.
And then he was like, yeah, no, it was fine. I was in and out. He was like, "How long were you there?" He was like, "Oh, 5 days."
It's insane.
You're like, what? Like, and he's part of that other generation, like my father's generation, which just would have died instead of like being embarrassed and talking about it, Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because I do find like that the health journey is the way to get into this conversation. I think for a lot of people, um, a podcast is a good way to kind of get into this because you're not part of a conversation, but you're listening in on a conversation.
Mhm.
And so you can hear people's experiences in the world, and then you can say, all right, well, how do I associate that with my own experience? Like, what am I doing wrong? Like, am I living, am I like working to live, or am I living to work?
Hmm.
Can I figure out a way to kind of hack the system in a way that brings me joy and brings me community and all of the stuff that people actually know, like the things that paleo didn't talk about when it became so highly focused on diet, was like how much of hunter-gatherer existence was sort of based upon an ideology of a group of people who like had like-minded pursuits, who had that looked out for each other, and sort of building community around that. And I think for men, like the percentage of men who have close personal friends who they talk to over 40 is like nothing in America. There's very few men who can actually even just talk about like any of the stuff that is happening to them, and there's a huge sacrifice to that I think the male community doesn't necessarily talk about all that much, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much power in this idea of mentorship, and just like thinking back even just like a few decades, like maybe when like your grandparents might have been living in your home with you
Mm.
into like a later age. Like
Hmm.
I think about the power of having a connection with the generations prior to me, and it's like it gives me so much perspective in the world. And like having that throughout your life, like with someone who's older, walked a different path and like done different things, it's so important. And yeah, I feel like a lot of, like echoing what you're saying, so many guys just don't have those outlets. So these podcasts, like feel like Joe Rogan is like the de facto father to a lot of like lost 20-year-olds.
Yeah, I would say that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so he was the first podcast I ever listened to. I was visiting a buddy who had moved out to Seattle, and we went to go hiking. We had this 8-hour hike that we had planned on doing, and he was like, "Hey, we're just going to listen to this podcast." And it was, in all honesty, it was the first time I had heard an adult, and Joe's an adult as much as anybody else is, but it was the first time I had ever. So I'm a father. I had 3 kids at this point. I'm going. I think I actually only had 2 kids at this point. And I'm like holding on to some idea of fatherhood, right? I'm holding on to it like in some sort of weird way, like that you just, imbibe from culture in every single way. Now you have this guy who's on there who's just talking about getting high, and like, just like who built this entire franchise, this entire empire, on just, having conversations with people. And one of the things I found really interesting was like, all right, well, what is adulthood? Like, what is the difference between like being an adult and who this guy is? And it finally broke me through. It's a lot of that stuff, and I was like, what am I doing? Like I always had like a very specific set of rules for how to treat the children when they went wrong, and I was like, why do I do that? Like I'm just repeating patterns that unconsciously that I'd been doing for a very long time. So I always had like a kind of warm space in my heart for Joe, because he was, he would just like have these conversations and just talk about like, all the stuff that guys would normally talk about, you know?
Yeah, you think about I mean, it would be insane to even try and calculate just the amount of breakthroughs that he's led to, for men or women, or like just encourage a different pattern of behavior or expose you to a different guest. Like you're talking about him changing the way that you thought about fatherhood and being an adult. And like, I think about, for me, him introducing me to Dr. Baker, and the first time I ever heard Rob Wolf was on his show. And I think probably the 3 of us can point to all these different conversations that Joe has had, or guests that he's had on, that have really challenged the way that we think. It's just really interesting to think about, and the value that can actually be gained from being willing to like listen in on these conversations, and then you absorb all the knowledge the years of knowledge accumulated by the 2 or 3 people that are engaging in that podcast. It's like, we've never been exposed to that any time in history before.
Yeah, it's going to be cool to like look back in a number of years and be able to see, like, just look at all these conversations that he's had. And like, I think the guy has had such a positive impact on so many people, but he has this like amazing skill set where he's like open, but has like, I feel like he does have like some pretty firmly held beliefs. So it's like this dichotomy in a person, like it almost is like 2 personalities within one, that lets people like speak to all their different curiosities, but he's like willing to push back on things. It's really a unique skill.
Yeah, I think when Wim Hof told him that you couldn't get knocked out if you had done his type of breathing, Joe was like, bullshit. It's not exactly the way Wim Hof said it, but Joe was like, what are you talking about, dude?
But it's important though to like be willing to listen to a show where the host is willing to push back on certain ideologies of the guest. And it's something that we think a lot about too, now being our own show. We're very curious. We do have some firmly held beliefs, but like, I think there have been a few times where I've had guests that have come on and afterwards, I'm like, shit, could I have challenged that person more? It's an interesting position just to be a host of something like that.
Yeah. I just recently did a podcast episode with Peter Goodman, who is a New York Times reporter who specifically wrote, he's been to Davos, the meeting of billionaires in Switzerland. He's been there like 12 times.
Wow.
And he's righteously angry about the amount of influence that these guys have had on the world. And so I was able to kind of get him on the podcast, and he sat down for about an hour to kind of talk about it. The book is brilliant. But he, at one point he said something to the effect of, well, he was like, I know people go very quickly to conspiracy theories, and I just don't want to necessarily go there. But I'm like, and I like, part of me was like, oh, I kind of want to push, like I was like, but it at this point, it's an open conspiracy. Like what we have is something that looks banal, right? Like they're not like eating babies and, boiling up like young virgin women or anything like that to get at their brains so that they can live forever, nor are they lizard-headed people. But it's an open conspiracy to say that these are the people who actually run our world, and they get to decide what our future looks like. And so I kind of wanted to push back on that. And I was like, I don't, he was so kind to actually come on the podcast to just talk about his stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, you do have those opportunities sometimes.
Such a delicate balance, like not being like politely pushy. It's like, how do I get this person to like address maybe like something that I don't agree with, but also not be rude and like piss them off?
Yeah. I mean, with time, I think the thing about Joe is he's gotten presidential candidates to sit on for 5 hours. Like, at what point do you ever get that? You can't live in your own bullshit for 5 hours. You're going to talk about things that Joe wants you to talk about, which I just find is pretty intense.
Yeah. And I think you could probably learn a lot from the people that will refuse to go on his show, which I think tells a lot, because, I think we're all thinking, okay, well, what do you have to hide, or what do you not want people to know about you? If you're not willing to just go have a long form conversation, why do I always need to see you speaking on a 45-second bit on Fox or CNN or something like that? It's almost been like the ultimate source of truth and knowledge, and like a lie detector for people.
Yeah. So have you guys gotten a lot of pushback in the social media from people who disagree with you? Like,
I'd say it's come about sporadically and not frequently, which is interesting. I'm curious to see if it continues that way. Like, we definitely have gotten pushback, but it really hasn't,
not coordinated.
Yeah, it hasn't felt like coordinated or anything. Like, I think that we've maybe flown under the radar for a little while, or just haven't been as pointed about certain things. But there definitely have been moments where we've gotten pushback. Like, Pito was saying stuff, like was commenting on our stuff at one point. So like, that's always fun. But yeah, nothing too crazy. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, I would say that Yeah, we haven't had anything too contentious. I mean, it was interesting the other day. I had posted a video of myself at Target, just walking through just like the advertising perspective of Oatly and just what, how these new big food companies are really run like technology companies, and they know how to window dress the label to the point where it's like a billboard. But then if you go to the back to the ingredient list, that's really the source of truth. And we've almost been brainwashed into living in a world where we think that this like oat milk alternative is healthier than, raw milk from a local farmer. And that somehow ended up filtering into the vegan algorithm. It ended up getting like 2 million impressions, but the sheer amount of just like negativity and people telling me to kill myself and all this stuff. And also just like misconstruing the video. Like people thought that I was being paid off by Big Dairy to promote that.
Oh yeah. That's
where it's like, all I'm trying to do is just give you a thought-provoking piece, just to realize that like, these are what some of these companies are doing when you're going to buy your beverage or the food that you're going to consume. So I thought it was really interesting just to see that. That was probably the most negativity we've ever gotten. But it was like just good piece of learning, just to understand where the other side is coming from.
Yeah, I do think, like I have had as many conversations as possible on Twitter. And I'll be the first to admit I'm not my best person on Twitter. There's just something about that algorithm, just like just sets you off. But it is funny to me when you think about it, because really like the dialogue is between maybe like 40, 45 people, right? And all of the sort of infighting and cross-pollination of different ideas and negative feedback and all of that stuff is really like maybe 23 on one side, 23 on the other. And for the most part, like what I think you guys have been able to do is actually bring in a larger audience of people who don't necessarily understand, like, one, that there is an argument, right? Because that for us with Sacred Cow was like, the argument is so skewed in this one direction that it seems like this is inevitable. And so we were like, we have to create a film that's going to bring some sort of balance to the forest in a way. But like, you're bringing in people, like one of the things that, all right, in a better statement, you are able to get people involved in the fitness industry who care about nutrition to also then care about where their food is coming from and the places and the people who are making that food. And I congratulate you for that, because that is a hard pull, right? The fitness industry has its own sphere, and that sphere is really hard to kind of knock into. And you guys have done a bang up job of like actually bringing people into that.
Yeah, we appreciate the compliment. And I think it's like kind of one of the benefits of being a two-headed monster and having like a range of interests, and like also like participating in a lot of the fitness worlds. Like we both are endurance athletes and have done some Ironman events. So like we connect with that community on a different level, like through the endurance sports, but then they're like interested in what we do, and we can kind of like warmly introduce them to the ideas that we talk about. So I think that's kind of been how I don't know if you would agree with that, but like how we've been able to kind of like connect across a few different mediums, where it's like, just wide interest in being able to speak to different topics that we're maybe not equally passionate about, but have like more, more depth of knowledge in certain things. Like I think maybe like I take a little bit more to like some of like the soil health stuff, and Brett is probably a little bit more focused on like the fitness stuff. So it's like, I think that there's a nice balance there where we can but penetrate these different areas and kind of like bring it all together.
Yeah, I would say to that point, James, a win for us was we had on Robin Switzer on the podcast, who is running KetoCon in Austin. And I think that, it'll effectively replace PaleoFX as like the largest alternative health conference in the US over the next couple of years. And we had an amazing conversation with her, and we were able to convince her to start incorporating some sessions during KetoCon around food sourcing and regenerative agriculture and things like that. So, this April at KetoCon, we're going to get to lead a panel for them on regenerative agriculture and bring in a couple of our colleagues and friends that are first generation ranchers and just try and teach people about where their food comes from and food sourcing and buying beef in bulk and incorporating different cuts of meat. And we want to really be the bridge between fitness, nutrition, soil health, connecting with your local farmer, because all of these things need to be connected and not separate. Like a world where instead of someone going carnivore, they're buying their meat from ShopRite, but instead they're trying to go to their local farmer to buy their meat when they're starting a carnivore diet. Like that would be a huge goal and a great win.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think it's I'm currently reading David Montgomery.
Yeah.
Harry, you might not, right?
Yeah.
So his previous book was Dirt: The Erosion of Civilizations, and he kind of talks about like how the Roman Empire fell and how a number of different empires fell because they didn't take care of the soil. His new book is, and I actually want to get the title right, so I'll look it up as I'm telling this.
Growing a Revolution. Is that
No,
it?
it's it is What Your Food Ate. Yeah, and so he's going into like he's telling this one story about how they had these farms that this experiment was started in the late 30s in England, and he had 3 separate plots that were deeded to them. One was organic; it was animal manure and compost that was added. The other one was mixed use, was petrochemicals and chemical fertilizers plus manure, and then the third one was just the NPK fertilizers that were added. And they just noticed like the nutritional content just kept on going down, even when you had the manure with the fertilizers. They noticed that because the fertilizers were there, the uptake in nutrition was actually lower. And so it goes into this kind of like understanding that I think a lot of regenerative agriculture is kind of talking about. It's like they're grass farmers because it matters what those animals are eating. And if they're eating the right foods, then the uptake in nutrition, like there is still a lot of minerals and iron and zinc and folate and all of these different things that are in the ground that can't be accessed unless we actually build topsoil and the organic compounds that provide life for that soil. Then the plants themselves can't access all of that stuff into their roots. And so therefore you're eating foods that are nutritionally depleted to begin with. And they talk about like the levels of iron in beef going down over the past 50 or 60 years. So like even within communities that are eating meat, what we're finding is you're just not getting the same sources that you used to. And so like regen ag, I know you guys can probably taste the difference, right? You can taste the difference when you're on a plot of land that is dynamic, that has like insects, that has all of that stuff. And then you go and cook a ribeye from there and it's purple and you could taste the ground, like you'd actually taste the soil. It's pretty amazing.
Definitely. And I think one of the things that popped in my mind when you were speaking is we were on this road trip that we went on. We were lucky enough to speak with Will Harris, who owns White Oak Pastures, like one of the legends in the regenerative ag space. And he popped us in his Jeep after we had the conversation, and like he was in his element, and we were driving through the herd, and he started pointing out this mineral tray that he had laid out for his cows. And he started to explain to us that he lays that mineral tray out there so that the cows will go and take whatever minerals they need. And if they consume too much of, a certain mineral through their desecration and going to the bathroom, they'll actually remineralize the soil based on like what they're eating, what they're taking from that mineral. Because those minerals aren't just going to come out of nowhere. So it's just interesting, like hearing him say that and like hearing his story about how he like came to think of like doing that to help the soil, which then like makes the grass more nutritious for the next round of cattle that are going to be feeding off that grass. Like it's just like kind of like he's like re-engineering backwards nature through a mechanism of nature. It was cool.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the barrier for change for a lot of this stuff, especially with regen ag, isn't that high. Like convincing people to move over to a plant-only diet is a really hard pull, right? You just think of like the number of years, starting all the way back in the 70s, the saturated fat argument, the red meat is bad for you argument, that has been close to 50 years in the making. For the most part, people it did adhere to it, but it's like it's just so much harder to get people to conceptualize the idea of going completely plant only. And so like making this argument that you could like replenish the landscape, replenish the world, build back biodiversity, build back an ecosystem that actually looks like nature, that mimics nature, and then also feed people nutritious food that looks like real food, isn't that hard of a pull, right? Like you do have to pull people out of their city mindset, and that's hard, right? Even documentaries are hard. Like I have 90 minutes to make an argument for a documentary, like getting them out of that mindset, but like convincing them to build a world where they actually like sit down and nourish their families and do all of that stuff, like shouldn't be that much of a hill to climb.
It shouldn't be, but unfortunately, it's like we're combating against, to your point, 50 to 60 years of misinformation around, LDL cholesterol, saturated fat, red meat, even just the concept of eating for convenience and nuking a meal and sitting down and scarfing your meal at your desk or something like that and not digesting it properly. Like that's the opposite of nourishment versus what you're talking about of like actually being really intentional about sourcing your protein from, a regenerative farm that does things the right way. And then you learn a new recipe and you cook those ingredients with love and for people that you love and share the meal with people that you love. Like that's true nourishment. It's so much more than just food itself. It's the practices of how the food was raised. And also, what are you going to do with the food to prepare it for the people that you love? It's like this whole process. We were saying this to one of our guests yesterday. One of our buddies, his girlfriend is from Argentina. So she cooks with like a ton of, flavors and spices and things like that. So she made these incredible burgers like 2 summers ago where she mixed in ground beef with lamb and threw some really good quality onions and garlic and parsley and olive oil in there and just like prepared it in such an incredible way that even though I was eating the carbs from the bun, like we felt good after we were eating it. And I know it's like hokey pokey, but like it's freaking made with love and care and attention. And, you absorb that and you can feel that with the food that you're eating.
Yeah, I want to go back to one of the quotes that Dr. Tro made, because I think he's equally angry on Twitter in a good way.
We call him American English doctor.
But he's like he had a quote from one of his clients. He was like, you had somebody who has been on keto for only a few months, like I think it was like 4 or 5 months, and was like, my God, I'm not hungry all the time now. I'm just eating, and he has a very simplistic recipe on what you eat, right? He's not throwing in enormous amounts of like different ingredients and you're constantly sourcing materials from all over the place. He's actually just very simple recipes, like, and his clients were like, I am starving all the time. That's why I'm grazing. That's why I'm eating. That's why like the bowl of M&Ms that the secretary puts out of the office is something that I like can't walk past without, because you're starving. And I think that is one of the bigger problems is like we have a culture that it talks about blood sugar in a way that makes it sound like you're going to pass out if you're not constantly nourished with calories. And so I do think that the thing that happens with a lot of people who do start to eat this way is that they can actually go and take a 12-hour flight without eating, without being like hangry and like, I don't know, charging the fucking cockpit because you didn't get your cocktail, right? So I it does take a while to get people like revved up into this in a way, but like, even if you look at Twitter trending, was it Veganuary barely even trended at all this January, right? So
that's a good thing.
Carnivore diet was trending. Organinuary, I don't think that showed up, but that's still a long haul.
Maybe next year.
Maybe next year. But people are looking into it. They're just deciding in January that this might be something to kind of move forward on. And look, it doesn't work for me. Like, a carnivore doesn't work for me. Like
Mhm.
I actually like eat vegetables and love them and all of that stuff, but it's still a meat heavy diet, because what else am I going to fill it with?
Yeah. But even getting to that point, we've been talking about this a lot. And I think you had mentioned, like, you were asking us about the progression of the show. I think when we started, we came pretty hot out of the gate, being a little bit more dogmatic about carnivore and animal-based diets, which is really the wrong thing, the wrong approach if we want to actually have impact and change. Like, if you're fighting around whether or not you should eat vegetables or fruit, that's just the completely wrong argument that should be having. Like, for us now, we've changed our tune. If you're eating real foods, and our definition of real food is meat, fish, eggs, dairy, if you can tolerate it, fruits, vegetables, sourced intentionally, you're going to feel incredible, look amazing, and live the quality of life that you want. And that's something that we're spending a lot of time thinking about, is like, how do we actually change people's minds and open them up to what real nutrition actually is? Because, it's 70% of us are overweight or obese. It's like we've normalized disease. So I don't know. It's just you just reminded me that when you were talking about the vegetables and how carnivore doesn't work for you. Like, that's totally okay, but you're still eating real foods, and that's all we care about.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think that there's a lot of room for movement in talking about, like, when I eat for myself, because I have a pretty Spartan diet in comparison with the rest of my family. I have a zero waste diet, right?
Mhm.
I don't throw
Nice.
anything out, right?
Yes.
So, like that ribeye, if I don't finish it, then the next meal it's going to be gone. Like, and anything that I'm making, I'm eating the entirety of it, and what I'm not doing. So what I do is I shop for nutrient density, and because I'm constantly shopping for nutrient density, then I'm not looking for variety to fill in
Mhm.
those gaps. And I think that's kind of an important thing that needs to be kind of talked about more with this diet, is that you're not going to be spending, like, hundreds of dollars to buy, like, this, that, and whatever, to kind of fill in some sort of weird aspect ratio of, like, I might be low on, vitamin C, so I need to buy a bushel of this, or whatever. So, like,
Totally.
you're looking into these things in a very different way. And food waste is a huge problem.
Mhm.
Like, we buy food, and we buy it with the notion that we're going to sort of fill our fridge with all of this stuff, especially in January, right? Green juices and fucking spinach. I hate spinach. Like, any
So,
number of different things. You're like, yeah, it's fucking weird, man. It tastes like soap. Um, but, like, you do all that stuff, and then it just rots, And so, like, building a diet built on nutrient density is, like, it got to be the only way to go if you're talking about sustainability and regenerative work.
Totally. And you kind of reminded me of two conversations that we've had. One was with Joel Salatin, and we've talked to him twice, and he mentioned both times the food waste conversation. It's like 40 to 50% of the food that we grow and raise goes to waste. Like, that's such a inefficient for such a base layer function in society, like creating food. Like, that's such an inefficient model. Like, if we could reduce food waste, that would be such a win in terms of just like how we're allocating our resources as a
Yeah.
society. And then the other conversation you reminded me of was we had a conversation yesterday with the founder of a company called Pluck, and it's organ-based salts. So he blends different organs into this salt seasoning. He's an ex-chef, and he's just a really interesting guy. He was a great conversation, and he was just talking about this idea of nutrient density and like getting the right quality protein. And it's like, I think it's so important, like kind of moving away, like calories are important, but like moving away from the calorie model and starting to, or like at least having the idea that like vitamins and minerals from real whole food sources is more important than like looking at just calories in, calories out, because you can feel satiated if you have all of those vitamins and minerals that you need.
Yeah, we're stuffed and starved, I think, in many different
yes.
ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell me, like, you guys, what are you working on next? What's the, you got any like hidden stuff you're you did mention a documentary at one point.
Yeah, I think that that's still definitely a long-term goal. I think 2023 for us is the year of like just continuing to do more of what we're really good at. And we have so much fun doing the show. We love having interesting conversations. We love connecting with new people, and we love to think about different ways to make the show as digestible as possible so people can really take in what we're talking about. So I think for 2023, it's been a lot of investing in the show. So, me moving from San Diego to Austin so we can be under the same roof, so we can do more in-person episodes in studio, have great guests come in, have the compounding interest of us being under the same roof and always sharing ideas. I think that that's really exciting to us. And we're hoping that we can just really improve the quality of the show for our guest by taking that to the next level. But, I think down the road, we've obviously thought about, can you make the podcast a little bit more informative? Can you turn it into a documentary or a longer form piece of content that kind of contains the way that we think about nutrition and health? And maybe we can leverage all these incredible guests and topics that we've learned about into a longer form documentary. But I don't know if you think I'm missing anything, but from my perspective, it's just like, we just want to be heads down and put the best show out that we possibly can for people.
Yeah, I think the only thing I was going to add is I think what excites us about what we're doing is like this idea of building community. And like our show started entirely virtually. So like the first like 80 or like 90 episodes were basically all done virtually. And like that's very like challenging to like really get a good message across. And I think that there's something to having in-person events that you can bring people together who have shared interests or are curious. Maybe they bring a friend, they get introduced to new ideas and like see the realness of like these guys behind the screen. And so like we want to do like an in-person podcast set up like fairly regularly in Austin and just have great conversations with people and start building this just like idea of community around eating real foods and having these types of conversations. So that's just one other thing I would have added.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, thank you guys so much for coming on, man. It's always a good conversation. I love your enthusiasm and where you're taking all the work and diving into all of these different, stories and storylines. It's pretty cool.
Thank you, man.
We love it. We appreciate the support. It means the world.
We need to get back to you sending us your articles again. You used to.
How do we get back on the list?
Well, I did the conversation with Matt over at Northbridge or Bison, and he was like, "Yeah, send it to me." I was like, "You don't know what you're asking for, dude."
The most obscure things that you've never learned about and never heard about, send out every single day.
I have to say, I was you had sent me stuff a while ago that I had read, was going to do something with, and then just lost track of it. And I just yesterday revisited it and am going through and doing what I was originally going to do with it. So stay tuned. I'll tell you, I'm going to do a little piece on Adderall. So I know you had some stuff on it.
Yeah. The only other thing that I wanted to kind of say was that what I found actually really interesting about what you're building and the movement that you're building is I do find that within diet culture, one of the strangest aspects of it is how little people actually spend at the farms that are making their food. So you're not going to see some Oatly advocate on an Oatly farm, right? You're not going to see that. You guys are spending time, with the people who are producing your food, and that is such an integral element of building the bridges and the disconnects and breaking down those disconnects that we have with our food system. So I hope you do a lot more of that. The field harvest is always so fucking cool to watch anyway, and just, keep up the good work.
Thank you, man. We appreciate having you being able to be on your show. Like I said, I think it's a cool milestone for us because it just makes me think back to when we had connected really early on over Kellogg's Killing Boners. I think that's what I'd said off the podcast. And to see where we are now, it's really cool. And the best part for us is like actually building friendships with people like you. You meet the coolest people in this space.
Yeah. Cool, man. Cool. All right. Let me hit this off.
Thanks so much for listening to the Sustainable Dish podcast. If you like the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you'd like to support the work I'm doing on Patreon, please visit sustainabledish.com/join. As a Patreon subscriber, you'll get access to ad-free podcasts, plus exclusive video podcasts, never-before-seen interviews, and a discussion community. Go to sustainabledish.com/join, and thank you for your support.